This morning, my alarm went off at 5 o'clock, like it does every Sunday morning, and I laid there for a minute, and I thought two things at first. The first thing I thought was, I'm preaching today. And the second thing I thought was, I'm really grateful for that. I don't take this lightly. The fact that I come before you occasionally on a Sunday, sometimes it's Maggie, sometimes it's a guest, but we open the Bible and we talk about the Bible to you. We don't take that lightly. At the same time, we don't take ourselves so seriously that any of us think that we're the only ones who could do that for you, and we're careful to create a certain amount of diversity and variety in the people who are up here to deliver a homily. But I wanted you to know that I'm excited for today. And I'm excited every week when we get to open the Bible together, this sacred text that is mysterious and that causes all kinds of questions to crop up and yet is beautiful and amazing and has so much for us even now in our modern era. And the text that we've been in throughout the season of Epiphany and will be for several more weeks is called the Sermon on the Mount. And as I've spent more time in it, I've realized that it doesn't get that name just because of the location. It also gets that name because there is no way to summarize the Sermon on the Mount with one particular topic or idea. When I was in seminary, we had to pick like one big idea or main theme for the sermons that we were learning how to create and deliver. And I liked to bring up to our homiletics professors that Jesus didn't stick to one. He had several things that he would use throughout his sermons, and they didn't like that very much. And I also never got more than a B in a homiletics class, so I don't know if those are correlated or not. But I'm struck by the amount of ground that Jesus covers in this. I mean, if you were to say, what's one idea that sums up the entire Sermon on the Mount, good luck. After a service on Sunday, like after I preached today, somebody from our staff will come and ask me, what's the title of your homily for today? And the reason why they ask that is because it has to go on the title of the homily podcast. You may not know that we have one of those, but we do. If you go on Spotify and you search for Sacred Grace Homily Podcast, you'll find just the homily kind of all lined up, and they'll all be titled something. If you go on YouTube, you can find a full service for every single week that we've been recording. And the reason why we have somebody who's checking in on the title of the homily, and the reason why we have YouTube channel and Spotify and a live stream that some of you are watching on right now is because we have these incredible producers on our staff that you may not even know about. I have become extremely grateful for Devin and for Samuel and for Trey and for Erica, our producers who week in and week out make sure all of this stuff runs smoothly. Because before them, it was my responsibility and it was a disaster. And so I'm so grateful for their continued work to make all of this happen. So would you just give them a round of applause? Like, thank you for everything you guys do. It's incredible. There's no way we could do it without you. But none of them, no matter how much they pressed, would be able to come up with a single name or title for the Sermon on the Mount. This is what Jesus covers: blessing, light, the Mosaic law, murder, adultery, divorce, promises, pacifism, loving your enemies, generosity, prayer, fasting, possessions, and wealth, worry, judging others, and more. Now, does Jesus cover all of this in one single sermon? We don't exactly know. Is this a compilation of several different sermons? We don't actually know. But what we know is that Jesus covers a tremendous amount of ground. And for us, as we listen to it and as we experience it, we have the benefit of chunking it out week by week. And you have the benefit of sitting with each passage kind of one at a time. But there was no written record of this for a long time. I mean, people couldn't sit down and say, I think I'm going to read Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 16 today. It had to be passed down orally. It had to be the sort of thing that people remembered and treasured. And so we have a great privilege to have it just right in front of us here. Our text today is going to come from Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 26. It goes like this. Verse 13 through 16 goes like this. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Now, I'm going to approach this text the way that I usually approach the Bible personally. I don't always approach it this way when I'm delivering a homily, but when I am personally approaching the Bible, I approach it as a Q&A. I develop questions as I go along, and then I develop answers to those questions. I develop questions even if I already know the answer to avoid myself from putting the cart before the horse. I recommend that. You don't have to do it the same way as I do, but I recommend it as a possible way. If you're wondering, how do I even approach the Bible when I'm opening it myself, or I need a new way to think about this, consider these questions. The reason why I think questions are important is because questions create curiosity, and curiosity diffuses tension. This is true when we approach the Bible. It's true in our relationships. It's true with work. It's true with ourselves. When we approach things with questions, it creates curiosity, and that diffuses tension. Let's be more curious. Let's ask more questions. First question I have about this text is, who is you? I realize that that is grammatically incorrect. That's not really what I'm asking. Who is the you at the beginning of the statement? Who is you? You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. Well, just like the rest of the Bible, this isn't delivered directly to you, but it is absolutely written for you. You were not there, that you were not part of the audience. Jesus wasn't looking directly at you or like maybe thinking about you as you may have heard before and delivering this to you, but rather this is for you because it is recorded and is something that you can wrestle with and grapple with and consider and use for your own growth and development. It was not preached to you, but it was certainly preached for you. So who is the you? Well, it's you, but it's also the people who were there. So let's start with that. For the grammar geeks, it's the personal possessive pronoun, nominative second person plural. There's a word in the English language that sums up the weird words I just used. You might not know this, but the southern part of the United States is the most gender-inclusive culture in our country. I know that some of you might disagree, but for a long time, anyone who has introduced themselves, regardless of their pronouns, long before people were talking about gender fluidity or nonconformity, the South invented the word y'all. And y'all works for everybody. It works for one person. It works for 10,000 people. It works for somebody who is gender nonconforming or is transgender or is non-binary. It works for every single person. Y'all just works, all right? Works for everybody. I don't say it very often, but I probably should say it more often. Jesus is talking to y'all when he says this. When he says you are the light of the world, he's saying y'all are the light of the world. Y'all are the salt of the earth. And you know that when someone says you in our language, it can mean a couple of different things. And you know based on the context, when someone says you, they're not talking about you specifically. If I say you are my favorite, I don't think anyone in this room, save for Julie, is thinking I'm talking directly to them, okay? All of you would go, oh, he means our church. This group of people is his favorite. And that's true. You're my favorite. You are my favorite. Y'all are my favorite, okay? Jesus is talking to y'all, which raises a second question. A secondary question to this is, who was there? Who was there to hear this to hear this thing that Jesus had for them? Remember a few weeks ago I pointed out that it's unclear at the very beginning of this passage if Jesus was talking to just his closest friends or to a huge crowd. We typically imagine a huge crowd, but there's something in the way that this is phrased that actually implies that maybe it was just a few. But as the chapters go on and we get to chapter 7, it's clear that there's a multitude there. There's a crowd there. So either Jesus was talking to only his disciples at the beginning and a crowd formed over time, or there was a crowd there all along, or this is a compilation of several sermons, and in the first sermon he was preaching to only his disciples, and in the last sermon he's preaching to a huge multitude. We don't really know what it is, but we know that there's one consistent group that has been there the entire time, and that's his disciples. His friends, his closest tight-knit group, the people who had committed themselves to following him, the people who had developed enough curiosity to follow this guy around and keep asking question after question after question, even to the point of annoyance. They continue to wonder and question and listen and learn and grow and develop. But at this stage in the conversation, at this very stage, the disciples don't know very much about who Jesus is. It raises a second question on this text: what is a disciple? Am I a disciple? Are you a disciple? We oftentimes reserve that term, disciple, this somewhat antiquated term, for people who are the most ardent or committed or clear or serious or pious followers of the way of Jesus. Like we think about disciples of Jesus as the people who are certain or sure. You can probably think of somebody who comes to mind if you think of the word disciple. But more and more as I ask people, they oftentimes count themselves out. They think, well, that person's a disciple. They're like certain of their faith and they're following Jesus really well, and I look up to them. They're a disciple, but I'm not because I have questions. Or I'm not because I'm still curious. I'm not because I'm trying to figure out why there's so much violence in the world. Or I'm not because I'm trying to figure out why the church has always approached this one thing this one way. I'm really not a disciple because I'm not sure exactly where I stand on things. Let me remind you that the disciples in that moment on that hillside didn't know very much about this Jesus at all. This is early on in their relationship with him. And even in the few years that they get to know him, there was still so much left undone. There was still so much left unspoken. There was still so much for them to decide and figure out and understand. And now 2,000 years later, we're still doing some of the same things. When Jesus says, you are the light of the world, you are the salt of the earth, he's talking about you. Because if you're here right now, or if you're watching this on the live stream, or you're watching on YouTube after the fact, or you're listening to the podcast, or whatever, if you're listening to this, you're curious enough. You're curious enough to actually take a step in learning more. That puts you in disciple category. We've got to broaden the definition of what a disciple is. You are a disciple, which means you are a recipient of this teaching, which means you are the light of the world. You are the salt of the earth. A disciple is first someone curious enough to keep discovering. That's the first thing that they are. It's not the only thing that they are. I understand that, but it's at least that. A disciple is first someone who's curious enough to keep on discovering. And so what is salt and light? Why salt and light? Why are these used? Peterson helps us in the Message translation. He says this: salt is something that brings out the God flavors of this earth. Brings out the God flavors of this earth. Now, white people have a bad reputation for flavorless food, and that is well earned. I understand that, okay? Like, sometimes we just don't know how to season food, and our food is bland. I get that. But I've been experimenting with food for years, trying to change that reputation, okay? Trying to season food better, to make food more delicious, to make food more enjoyable. But the more that I try different spices, whether it's paprika or thyme or sage or whatever it is, the more that I use these different spices, I always find myself coming back to that OG spice, salt. Coming back to that over and over and over again. It's the spice I start with, and it's the spice I end with. When I'm cooking whatever the base of the meal is, I use salt in the cooking process, and then when I plate and serve the meal, I sprinkle salt over the top of it, because it all begins and ends with that. Salt isn't pushy. Salt doesn't make the meal about itself. Salt makes the meal about the meal. Salt makes something out of what's already there. It amplifies it. It points it out. It shows it to you. We often talk about the way of Jesus being joining God in what he's already doing in the lives that we're already living. Sometimes I've read this text and thought to myself, salt and light, boy, that's a lot of pressure. I've got to be the salt of the earth. I've got to be the light of the world. How am I supposed to do that? I'm not even sure if I'm a disciple, right? You know, I've wondered that throughout the years. But being salt is pointing out what is already there and amplifying it. Being light is shining light, exposing something that's already there and amplifying it for the world to see. I'm going to, mispronounce her name here. Ianla Van Zandt, who's an author and a communicator, says this: you are the light of the world. You are an instrument of the divine. You are the greatest miracle in the world. Life is graced by your presence. You're already those things. Simply holding on to and embracing the image of God in you, for you. These things are true about you. That gives you the opportunity, the ability to be the salt of the earth, the light of the world, to expose that which is God, that which God is already doing. Charles Spurgeon said, the Bible is not the light of the world. It is the light of the church. It's something that we continue to come back to. But the world does not read the Bible. The world reads Christians. You are the light of the world. I don't mean that as a way to pressure you into saying you've got to go and do something. It's really just exposing what is already there. God is at work around you. God is doing beautiful and amazing and wild and unexpected things around you. And as the salt of the earth and as the light of the world, you get to amplify that. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. whose day we just recently, as my son said, he got real excited. We're reading a book about MLK, and he goes, Dad, that's guy's graduation day. Sure. He said this, returning hate for hate multiplies hate. Adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of the stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. We are the light of the world, illuminating the darkness, pointing to the God flavors of the world, and amplifying those for the world to see. Mother Teresa said, often you can see power lines running along the street. Unless current is flowing through them, there is no light. The power line is you and I. The current is God. We have the power to allow the current to flow through us and thus to generate the light of the world, Jesus, or to refuse to be used and thus allow the darkness to spread. How do you become or live into, lean into being the salt and light of the world? It begins with, first, awareness, being able to know what the meal actually is so that you can be the one amplifying it with the salt, or to know what the work of God actually looks like and sounds like and smells like and what it actually, how it manifests itself, so that you can be the one shining the light on it and saying, that's something God's doing. It requires first that we're able to pay attention. And I'm of the opinion that actually that takes a really long time. It takes years of listening and paying attention and dissecting and excavating and just thinking, what is going on in the world around me so that I can point to it and see what God's up to. The second thing it means is being able to shed light on it and define that is something that is of God. It's not always this supernatural stuff. A lot of times it's the most ordinary things. It's found in that moment where you're making coffee for a friend in your house who's going through something. It can be very much a God moment if we're willing to shed light on it and add salt to it. It could be a meal that we share with a friend or a neighbor if we're willing to shed light on it or add salt to it. It could be on a very cold night like tonight where we go around and try to make sure that our neighbors experiencing homelessness or are involved in severe weather shelter network or at least have another blanket. Something to keep them alive. Salt and light. It could also be sharing about this salt and light with somebody who's hungry for it and wants to know more about it. That person in your workplace or in your neighborhood who's like, I'm feeling empty. Like, I'm not sure, I'm feeling aimless. Do you have any idea how many people in your life are feeling aimless and could use that little bit of direction in their life if you could just share with them the thing that Jesus continues to do for you over and over and over again? Not just that one-time thing, but that love that he keeps lavishing on you. What if you were that kind of salt and light? You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. It's not that person you're thinking about when you're thinking of the word disciple. It's you. It's me. It's us. We get to do this. It's a great privilege that God continues to give us. Let's pray together. God, thank you for the grace that you continue to give us in calling us to hard or even maybe even for some of us easy things like being salt and light. Wherever we land and fall in the spectrum of discipleship, God, I pray that you would build into us a fervor and a desire and an excitement for exposing and amplifying the things that you're already doing around us. Give us eyes to see and ears to hear. We pray these things in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.